Okay, good morning. I'm Trevor Morrison. I'm the Dean of the Law School here, and I'm glad to say welcome to all of you and to thank you for joining us for the Reese Center on Law and Securities Conference, National Security and Shifting Geopolitics, Challenges at Home and Abroad. This is a really exciting time for the law school and for this center. It marks the beginning of a new chapter in the work of our center. In the time since the center was founded in 2003, the issues that it is focused on, that practitioners in the field of national security law and policy have focused on, those issues have evolved considerably. And as those issues have evolved, the focus and work of the center has evolved too. Now, as our conference title suggests, this conference comes at a time of real change and uncertainty in the world, and along with it, real change and uncertainty in the field of national security. And so, we as an institution have been engaging in a process of reflection and renewal to ensure that our work to advance an informed public dialogue and in our academic focus on training the next generation of national security leaders, that we are oriented towards the future of this field and challenges that we will all be grappling with for the years to come. And so we have some significant changes to celebrate here today as we kick off this conference. One is that the Center on Law and Security is now the Reese Center on Law and Security, in honor of the very significant contributions and leadership of our friend and graduate Rick Reese and his late wife, Bonnie Feldman Reese, and their family. Rick, would you just stand so that we can recognize you? Rick has been an enormous friend to the law school across decades, and we'll have more to say in thanking and celebrating him later today. But Rick, thank you for your commitment to the school and to the center. It's a great honor to be able to name our center for you and your family. We also have a number of leadership changes at the center. We have a fantastic new executive director, Rachel Goldbrenner. This is the point where I say, without Rachel, none of us would be here this morning, and that is literally true. So Rachel, thank you for coming aboard. She comes to us with terrific experience and a lot of energy. She served as senior policy advisor to the permanent representative in the Washington, D.C. office of the U.S. mission to the UN, where she advised Ambassador Samantha Power. She's held numerous other high-level posts, including at the National Security Council and in the State Department, and she's a graduate of the law school as well. We're thrilled to have her with us. And we have a number of new faculty co-directors of the center, joining Sam Raskoff, who, though on leave from the faculty, continues to be a faculty co-director. The new co-directors are David Golov, Stephen Holmes, Ryan Goodman, all seated here, and me. And so let me applaud the other three. David, Stephen, and Ryan all bring extensive national security experience and broad-ranging perspectives to the work of the center, and it's really been a collective effort to redefine what we want the center to be working on and to be taking stock of this moment in national security law and policy, both domestically and internationally. We as well have signed up a terrific roster of affiliated fellows and advisors, and you can see the amazing backgrounds of the full group on the center's website. We have a number of them here this morning, though, so if you are a fellow or advisor to the center, please just stand. Here's Tess is one. Here's Lisa, there's another. Great, in the back, Nick. Thank you very much, all of you. I do want to especially recognize our distinguished senior fellow, Lisa Monaco, who's been with us now for a couple of years, teaching as an adjunct member of our faculty. She's just brought tremendous wisdom and energy and insight, both into the classroom and to the research projects of this center, as well as our Center on Cybersecurity. You all know Lisa, of course, as Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama, having had really a storied career in public service leading up to that moment. You'll be hearing more from her later today in the final panel discussion, but I just did want to take a moment, Lisa, to say how much we appreciate your partnership and leadership. So all of us are excited about the future of the Reese Center. We have a new website. I'd urge you to visit it, lawandsecurity.org. You can keep abreast of our work there. And I'm really grateful to all of you for being here this morning for what I hope to be, I'm sure will be, a terrific conference. And so with that, we will begin the first panel, which I'm going to be moderating, but let me invite John Bellinger, Avril Haines, and Jake Sullivan here to the podium. Okay, so the title of our first panel is Seismic Shifts, Changing Priorities and Competing Visions for a Rules-Based Order, Rules-Based International Order. And we're just thrilled to have these three fantastic panelists. If I were to give a full introduction to any of them, that would be the day. So I'll give preposterously abbreviated ones. John Bellinger is a partner at Arnold & Porter, former legal advisor at the State Department, and senior associate counsel to President Bush, and also legal advisor at the National Security Council. Avril Haines is now a senior research scholar at Columbia University and also a lecturer at Columbia Law School. She was deputy national security advisor to President Obama and also deputy director at the CIA. And Jake Sullivan is a visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School and was national security advisor to Vice President Biden, director of policy planning at the State Department, and deputy chief of staff to Secretary of State Clinton. Thank you all for joining us this morning. It's great to have you here. So we're going to sort of organize this panel with some open-ended questions from me, inviting thoughts from each of our panelists. We'll move from there to some questions and conversation between and among, and then we'll reserve time at the end for questions from all of you. So, Avril, to kick things off, let me ask you, what would you identify as the major geopolitical trends at play in this moment that national security lawyers and practitioners need to focus on? In other words, thinking in geopolitical terms, what's changing?
There's so much. It's hard to know where to start with a question like that. Could I possibly focus in on maybe trends that I think are relevant to the international order?
Sure.
And so how we should be thinking about them?
Yes, very much. Yeah.
So one of the trends that I think is important in this area is actually, and this may be a way of overstating it in order to really sort of bring it to the fore, but in a sense, the kind of collapse between what are domestic affairs and international affairs. And I think that raises a number of challenges for the international order. And one way you might think about that in terms of how it is that that should affect how we think and craft an international order is that you really do need to take into account more and more what's happening domestically as you're thinking about what your foreign policy and international framework should be. So that would be one that I think is important to think about. Another one is, in a sense, some people talk about the rise of non-state actors. Others talk about diffusion of power, going from a sort of a bipolar to a multipolar world. I think there are a series of things that are happening there that are relevant to the international order. One might be that the sort of allied and partnered framework that we grew up with, in a sense, is shifting. And this question of how does that affect the international order and how should we be redesigning it, in effect, to take into account those challenges. And you know, in many respects, the allies that we came out of World War II, we think of them as being states that shared many of our values and principles, and that therefore they were our allies, and we should be thinking about them from that perspective. I think you see some of that shifting, and the question is, how does that affect how we organize ourselves, and who should be a part of our agreements, and how should we be structuring our international organizations as a whole? But the other piece, of sort of rise of non-state actors and diffusion of power, also is relevant, and I think in different ways. And I see that as being more and more, we have non-state actors that we want to constrain and that we want to empower through our international frameworks. And that needs to be taken into account as you evolve your international order, in a sense, in that context. So that's another area. Another is the sort of, as I was saying, diffusion of power, which is not unrelated to the last two that I just mentioned, but I think is still yet another crank at the wheel of thinking about how do we think about actors in this space, even state actors, and the fact that power is shifting. In many respects, people would say from the west to the east, but I think there are other ways to think about it. So that's another trend line that I think is important. There are a number of substantive trend lines that need to take into account international order. Cyber is one of them, climate, inequality. There's a variety of things that I think we need to think about in those spectrums. Another one that I think is very important to the international order is some of our own domestic dysfunction. So a piece of that would be if you believe that the international order, in a sense, has to evolve and that the international frameworks that we work through have to evolve, well, then you generally need to actually have a domestic system that is capable of assisting in that evolve process, right? So in other words, how challenging is it to get international agreements through the Senate makes a difference, right? To whether or not you're capable of evolving the international framework for the future. So those, I would just lay down a few of those things. I mean, there's a variety of other trends that are probably worth thinking through as we're going through this, but just to start us off.
Great, thank you. So John, let me ask you, thinking about any of those trends, and as Avril says, there's a lot we could talk about here. Do you think of this moment, or is it right to focus on this moment, or more of a kind of long-term trend? Is there pressure in light of these changes on the basic framework of the post-World War II international order, whether we think in terms of international organizations, key multilateral treaty arrangements, even the way the United States, for example, has positioned itself with its allies, and Avril referred to this. Is this a time of, you know, some tension, but that happens inevitably when you're in the change point, or is there some more profound pressure that might be threatening even the stability or continued existence of basic pillars of post-World War II international order?
Great, thanks, Trevor. People always hate it when you start with shout-outs, but this is such an extraordinary gathering that I have to start with at least one or two shout-outs. One, to congratulate all of you all on the new center. Rachel, who I've known for a long time, this is an extraordinary get for you all here at NYU. Mr. Reese, who I just met for the first time, thank you for what you've done here. And then it's just a great honor. Avril, with whom I work in the legal advisor's office, is probably the finest international lawyer I've known. You want to know why I am mad at President Obama? So Avril was nominated to be the first woman legal advisor ever in history, and she would have been the greatest legal advisor ever, and was about to go through Senate confirmation when President Obama realized that she was even better than that, and he pulled her nomination and brought her first to the CIA and then to be Deputy National Security Advisor. So State Department lost an extraordinary lawyer. And Jake, I think as everybody knows, would have been National Security Advisor had the election gone a little bit differently. But anyway, it's nice to be here with you all. So you know, we talk a lot about, is the rules-based system in crisis right now? Is it all falling apart? This is sort of all the rage in all the academic literature. Is it the end of the post-world order? No more international institutions? I think that's somewhat overstated, but we're clearly in a pretty rocky patch right now. I mean, this is a difficult time for the post-World War II rules-based order that was based on international institutions, democracy, free trade, and largely led by the United States. All of those things are under assault for a variety of reasons, and the lead of which, but not the only part of which, is that the US has in fact abdicated the leadership that it has exerted for 70 years, and not only just sort of retrenched, but as we all know, President Trump has really been attacking the system. He's been attacking allies, he's been attacking alliances, he's been attacking free trade, he's been attacking the very idea of democracy for things that were sort of deeply important to me, sort of international law and international institutions. It actually had not been quite so much for about the first 20 months, I think in part because there were actually not senior officials who cared that deeply, literally, about international law or international institutions per se, until in March, then John Bolton came in. I was legal advisor for the State Department while John Bolton was the ambassador to the UN, and John does care deeply about these issues. So we're seeing actually a further shift just since March with, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a little bit about withdrawals from more treaties, assaults on the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. So we're seeing even more of a change. But again, it's the troubles for the rules-based system are not just because of the Trump administration. We have Russia and China asserting more muscle, questioning the system, and beyond that, the rules-based system from the post-war era was not perfect. There were a lot of people left out. It was really a transatlantic Western system that didn't include Asia, the Middle East, much of the developing world, and those countries were feeling left out. So it really did need to be modernized and updated. We have, in addition, Europe is going through very difficult problems. Germany, which had been the leader of Europe for 20, 30 years, has been through a difficult patch. And of course, we have the Brexit that we're looking at. And then finally, we have populist influences all around the world. So all of these contribute to the problems with the rules-based system. I do think that it is resilient, that we can try to work to modernize it, but it's going to go through a tough patch. And I just will end with this point, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later, is, to your point, is this completely new? At least with respect to the United States, I do think this is probably the first time we have seen the President of the United States and a whole party sort of attacking internationalism as deep and democracy as we have now. But remember, we have gone through since the beginning of the Republic these periods of isolationism, nationalism, suspicion of international institutions. The America First was not something invented by the Trump administration. This was invented by people, including some well-known names, to try to prevent us from going into World War II with the same sort of suspicion of foreign entanglements. In the 1950s, many people have forgotten this. Senator Bricker introduced a number of amendments because he was concerned about treaties and treaty-based law and the United Nations, and wanted to introduce a constitutional amendment that would have prevented treaty law from interfering with the rights of Americans. Does this sound familiar? And you know who ultimately killed it? It was Dwight Eisenhower working together with Lyndon Johnson, who was then majority leader, who together killed the Bricker Amendment and really put us back more on a more reasonable course. So the point is, we do go through these up and down periods of time. I worry that we're in a pretty deep trough right now.
Okay. Jake, love to get your thoughts on any of this, including if there's anything new about the moment where we are now, what seems to be driving that. I guess also I want to ask, so if we, as John points out, there is a lot of writing right now about the imperiling of the international rules-based order. So what's the alternative to that? If that order is in danger of crumbling or being compromised in some serious way, domestically, I suppose John's suggesting it's something like isolationism as opposed to global engagement. What's the international version of that? Just some sort of Hobbesian state of nature?
Well, let me start by saying that it's always hard to identify exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the liberal international order. I once used this phrase at a campaign event in Ohio in 2016, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I don't know what that is, but I don't like any of those three words. And this, I think, reflects a certain sense among people in the United States. They're not quite sure what this disembodied liberal international order is. And, I think each of us probably has a slightly different definition sitting on this panel. I mean, I guess for me, what we're talking about here is a set of rules, institutions, and partnerships that were set up after 45, but I think what we're actually mostly talking about today is post-89, where, because from 1945 to 1990, as John was mentioning, you had a completely bifurcated system. You had a first world and a second world, and then theoretically a third world, a non-aligned movement. And it's only after 89 that the US begins to conceive of this order as truly global and truly liberal, that somehow, inexorably, as the international economic order goes global, eventually the international political order will too, that countries like China, after they come into the WTO, will liberalize politically. And of course, that never entirely happened. So a lot of what we talk about with the crisis of the order today is more of a crisis of dashed expectations than us moving backwards in terms of the role of liberal values in the system. We sort of thought China would get there. We thought Russia would get there. They never did. And so now today we're waking up and saying, oh my gosh, they're not going to, there's a crisis. So I start there. For me, the main elements of this, the things that we really have to focus on are how well is this system of rules, institutions, and partnerships working in terms of preventing conflict, setting rules that govern transnational and international conduct, and mobilizing cooperation on key challenges. And here, I agree with John that I think the single biggest threat to the order is not the challenge from other actors or the difficulty of the new trends that Avril described, but rather the United States' own relationship to the order. When you worked in government in either a Republican administration or a Democratic administration before Trump came along, the US was the constant and everybody else was the variable. Now the US is the single biggest variable in international politics today. And the alternative to the order, to your question, Trevor, is not isolationism. It's predatory unilateralism. It is the United States deciding that actually multilateral arrangements work to constrain US power in ways that are antithetical to US interests. And in that sense, it's an American approach that looks a lot like the way China and Russia look at the world. That's what Trump is really all about. He believes that any multilateral arrangement, by definition, is the concession of US bargaining power, because if we bargain with every country one by one, we're bigger than they are, so we can get more out of them. That's true with trade, it's true with alliances, it's true with any other means by which we want to work with another country. So if Trumpism takes hold over the long term, then yes, it is going to sound, I think, the death knell of the liberal international order, because the United States will be working with the other major powers to weaken and erode international institutions across all three of those dimensions: preventing conflict, setting rules, and mobilizing cooperation. But I would argue that if Trumpism doesn't become the order of the day over the long term, that the system is deeply resilient and has been working better in the last 10 years to do some of those things that I just described than it was before. Whether you talk about climate change and the Paris Climate Agreement, or you talk about the remarkable cooperation with the creation of the G20 under the Bush administration that kept a global financial crisis from turning into a worldwide depression, stopping the Ebola virus from spreading across the continent of Africa and potentially across the ocean, getting the Iran nuclear deal. And the last thing that I'll put on the table before stopping in this initial round is, a lot of people ask the question, okay, well, don't we just have to wait out Trump? Maybe he'll just be 4 years and then we can kind of get back to business as usual. Number one, it does seem to me that the answer of we'll get back to business as usual is an insufficient answer for the reasons that both Avril and John laid out, that this order does need a renovation and an update to deal with the major trends and drivers. Number two, and maybe even more importantly, even if you get a new president in 2021, there is no telling that in 2025 we don't have Trump 2.0. And the international system is now going to have to adapt to a world in which the United States will be a permanent variable, no longer just a constant. We can't just come back in 2021 and say, okay, Iran deal, Paris, don't worry, it's all good, and have people really count on that. So for me, the order of the day then is sufficient flexibility and agility in the design of these systems that they can withstand a more inconstant United States. And actually, I think the Paris Climate Agreement in this regard is quite a remarkable document, because here we are, the US is pulled out of it, and yet, because of other actors in the US, the private sector, sub-state actors, and the work of the rest of the international community, it is possible that this can still succeed over time. And I think that kind of model, that kind of thinking is going to have to be taken on board by international lawyers, both in the United States and globally. How do you craft institutions for a world in which the relative commitment of the major actors in the system is going to dial up and dial back depending on domestic political developments? That's a huge challenge for a design challenge, but I think it's a crucial thing for us to put on the table, because it's going to become the watchword for how we think about making international commitments as we go forward.
Great. So I'd love to sort of ask for reactions from John and Avril to that. I think that this last point of Jake's is quite interesting, if I understand it right. It's that in some ways, the instability that the current administration in the United States has injected into the understanding of the United States on the part of actors around the world means that the test for the resilience of contemporary and future international rules-based order will really be its capacity to continue to function effectively without depending on the United States as a constant.
Or with the U.S., instead of thinking of it in linear terms, either we're going to be back for good,
Right,
or we're
right.
going away for good,
Right.
to deal with the United States that will continue to be a major actor, a major contributor,
But that can't be counted on in the
Can't
same
be
way.
can't be necessarily counted on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Reactions?
Okay. I think, let me start with where you started, Jake, because I think the question of what is the international order is sort of at the base of maybe answering the final question in this
Sure.
case from my perspective. I do think it means a lot of things to a lot of people, and I do think that becomes one of the challenges in this discussion. And then it morphs into, well, so then how do we rethink the international order? How do we explain how valuable it is? This sort of thing, right? And not the most useful conversation. But from my perspective, I think if you just start with the basic point that you believe that engagement with other countries is something that is actually useful and critical to our national security and our interests from the United States perspective, if you start from that perspective, and if you also agree, and I think most lawyers will agree, right? Like, it's sort of one of these very classic things where you sort of say, okay, well, so if we agree that engagement is important, if we recognize that what's happening abroad is important to our interests on a regular basis, then you also sort of get into the space of, okay, well, so then it's useful to have mechanisms through which to engage. It's useful to think through in advance what are the principles that we should be joining on. It's useful to organize our engagement in a particular way. That doesn't mean that any engagement is useful. It doesn't mean that any set of rules is useful. It doesn't mean that, right, like that you've accepted a particular framework, but rather that you think a framework is probably something that you should be pushing towards, right? It seems unlikely that that's going to disappear on some level, right? And that it is a fact that we're going to need to continue to do that. If you take that perspective, then you recognize, well, okay, so things need to evolve, and that's a critical aspect of having a framework that is consistent with our interests and also one that is imbued with our values. And as a consequence, I think it's true then that one of the greatest threats to our framework system is anything that prevents it from evolving. And the dysfunction in our system is preventing it from evolving, right? That we see specific issues that need to evolve, and most people agree on them, but actually the reaction to the system is actually making it more challenging for us to evolve the system and into something that actually makes more sense to most people, right?
So to concretize that, is
Yeah.
this coming back to your earlier point about the difficulty of concluding a new treaty or ratifying it through the Senate at this point, something
It
like
is
that?
to some extent, but it's
Okay.
also connected, I think, to what both John and Jake were then pointing out, which is that the United States has been a critical author of the system, right, and has an outsized, in a sense, influence on the system. And as a consequence, our dysfunction is outsized in terms of our ability to stymie the
Okay,
system,
yeah.
right? And I think that is, in fact, one of the great challenges that we're facing. What I'm not sure about, like, from my perspective, Trump is clearly having a negative impact on that. I don't disagree with that. But I also do see it, I think, as John indicated, and I think you probably do too, but this is a trend line, right? This is not just Trump. This is something that we've seen prior to Trump. This is something that we're fighting, in a sense, for many years now. And so the answer, I think, is not just getting rid of Trump, but it's actually figuring out how do we attack what is underlying that trend line. And that's been one of the crucial questions, I think, even coming into the Obama administration. People say, well, how do we change this? I mean, when we look at, it's true that the Bricker Amendment was a perfect example, right, of, you know, this kind of isolationist kind of, you know, reaction to the international order in a way. But still, when you think about, you know, when Jesse Helms was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Clinton was the president of the United States, we were still getting, you know, roughly 25 treaties a year done, right? And since 2009, it's been about 2.5 a year, right? So you see an enormous just trend line down. And you see that in a variety of different spaces where it's just increasingly challenging for the United States to be a leader in this space. And I think what's happening right now in the context of Trump is creating that problem. I also would say that another issue besides the United States that I think is as critical really goes to this question of expectations. I think that it was remarkable to watch from an international perspective, not just the United States, right, but an international perspective, the expectations that were put on international organizations, what they could achieve, you know, for individual rights, for pushing back on bad actor, you know, behavior by states, by others, and we haven't seen international organizations be capable of actually pushing back on some of that activity. And I think that has created, just as we've seen in our own domestic systems, the distrust of big authorities. I think we see in the international system a sort of a reaction to the fact that international organizations have not lived up to the expectations and that the order has not delivered the results that in a way were promised through this great preambular, you know, language that typically precedes it. And I think that's something too that we have to sort of right size what the expectations are, but also invest in the institutions that are supposed to deliver these, you know, such great results.
John?
So let me make 4 quick points. One, just to reiterate something that both my colleagues said, and I think people need to leave the room with, is that the international order rules-based system was not perfect. You know, we can't be too nostalgic. We can't go backwards. You know, it's a myth that it was, in fact, even an order. There was a lot of breaking of the rules, even by the United States, and a lot of countries sort of felt left out by it. So clearly needs to be, you know, updated and modernized. Even from the point of view of the United States, it was not perfect. So, you know, as it pains me often to say it, but I think most of us will agree, there's more than a kernel of truth and a lot of Donald Trump's concerns. He just doesn't go about acting on those concerns the way maybe, you know, some of the rest of us would, and I'll come back to that point. But, you know, there were problems with our trade deals. Everybody, even sort of pro-trade Republicans, you know, felt that there were problems with NAFTA. Jake was working with Secretary Clinton, and, you know, she was against TPP. The climate agreement, you know, had to frankly be done not as a treaty because this administration recognized that it couldn't possibly get through the Senate, which shows that there wasn't enough support for it. And on the Iran deal, although I would have stayed in it, you know, it was very controversial amongst both sides. So, you know, a lot of these recent agreements that Donald Trump has pulled out of, you know, there had been concerns overall. Let me say a quick word about treaties because it's interesting. We are really at a trough in terms of getting treaties through the Senate. I don't know whether we will actually ever come back again. Here's an interesting statistic for you. In the 8 years of the Bush administration in which I served, we got 163 treaties through the Senate. That's probably more treaties in an 8-year period of time than in any point in American history, and that for a president who was supposedly viewed as not international. A lot of the credit actually goes to Avril, who was head of the treaty office at the State Department at the time, and then working briefly up in the Senate. But many of these were multilateral treaties, human rights treaties, law of war treaties, environmental treaties, multilateral treaties. So, these were things that President Bush looked at personally. Each of these treaties goes across the desk of the President of the United States. They are not delegated to anyone else. He has to sign the treaty out and send it to the Senate. And then after the Senate gives advice and consent, he comes back to the President. He has to personally ratify it. So the President involved in treaties. As Avril said, I think in the Obama administration, only 20 treaties got through the Senate. Enormous difference. That's 163 versus 8, and I think we're now at something like 5 or 6 treaties through the Trump administration. So we've lost the consensus really on doing international agreements, at least through the Senate. And then finally, last point, on U.S. leadership. I guess I need to spend more time myself in areas where there are large numbers of Trump voters, because I guess I understand the concerns that they have about the U.S. place in the world. I just don't understand why they would support the way the president goes about doing these things. In that, U.S. leadership is, in my view, and certainly in the view of more establishment Republicans, has not been to go, beat up on allies, attack alliances, and really isolate the United States. When we want things, we work through alliances, we work with our partners. It can be a lot of heavy U.S. pressure. We know how to pressure other countries, but it's not so much attacking them and isolating them. So it's puzzling to me that there is support for the foreign policy approach that the president is currently taking, because I don't see that so much as U.S. leadership, but the abdication of U.S. leadership.
Let me ask a question along those lines. We should, still talking about the U.S. in particular, though we should maybe bring in some discussion of other players like China and Russia and what's their relationship to an international rules-based order. But a little more on the U.S., let me try a sort of devil's advocate question. From the perspective of at least some outside the United States, observing U.S. behavior, and let's take Jake's helpful sort of temporal frame. I think it is post-1989 largely that we're talking about. To the extent that some might say that to the extent the United States was an adherent to an international rules-based order, it was maybe only because that was an effective way for the United States to project national power and to pursue national interest. That this didn't reflect some larger commitment to a set of international norms for their own sake, or a commitment to the notion of that kind of arrangement as a good way for countries to cooperate together, but it was an effective means to the end of projecting national power and pursuing national interest. And if those are always the watchwords of US foreign policy, that is pursuing and projecting those things, then the difference between the Trump administration and the administrations that preceded it is just a difference in the choice of means. The ends are the same, and it's just a belief that these international organizations maybe are too constraining of the pursuit of national interest, or that they can no longer, real devil's advocate position, can no longer be manipulated by the United States sufficiently to allow the US to pursue its own national interest through those organizations, so they ought to be set aside. If that's the approach one took, then there wouldn't seem, I guess, to be a radical difference between pre-Trump administrations and the Trump administration. It would just be kind of a calculation about whether these international arrangements are really worth it, or whether it's better just to pursue national interests more directly in more bilateral or even unilateral ways. So what would be the answer to that skeptic?
Well, for me, it calls to mind a really vexing feature of the debate in 2016, which is Trump says America first, and everyone's sort of like, oh my gosh, America first, how? Yes, of course, America first. Okay, I mean, what person serves in the US government and wouldn't say, I put the interest of the United States of America first. I swore an oath to the Constitution. I am here every day defending our national interests. And yet somehow he was able to set up a debate where it's like, I'm for America first, they're for America somewhere between 2nd and 17th. I don't know. Depending on whatever their globalist, alternative agenda looks like. So part of the answer to your question is, of course, this is fundamentally about how you advance America's national security interests and what the best means of doing it is. And yes, a lot of the times that we talk about the liberal international order, we use it interchangeably with a notion of American leadership, even American primacy, and that was the way in which we secured our own interests and also set up a system that reflected our principles and our preferences. And I don't think any of us should make apology for that. I think the big difference is that there is a difference, that there's a distinction between kind of naked self-interest and enlightened self-interest. That the major divergence of Donald Trump from previous presidents is not placing paramount priority on America's national security interests. It's a view that the best way to accomplish that is zero-sum rather than positive-sum. So previous presidents thought, of both parties, we are better, safer, and stronger when others are better, safer, and stronger. And so we're going to set up a system in which, yes, we're going to help create the conditions so that China can have this remarkable rise. That was not a failure of the liberal international order, whatever we're calling it. It was the natural product, in a sense, a success of what we established. And what Trump has basically come along and said is, the only way to truly effectively advance our interests is to take a mentality that if another country is gaining, we necessarily must be losing. And for me, that is the big distinction. So that it's not a distinction between putting the US national interest first, it's a distinction between playing that national interest out, not merely on a tactical basis, but on a conceptual basis, that conceptually we can have a positive sum framework of dealing with other countries where we can get to outcomes that work for us, but also work for them and work for the system as a whole. Totally imperfectly with all the caveats and errors and shortcomings we described before, but I think that is what's fundamentally under challenge right now. That when Donald Trump says they're laughing at us, that's what he's talking about, that this positive sum idea is a sucker's game. And I think we need to interrogate the extent to which we got so comfortable with that we lost a little bit of sight of the bargain with other countries. But I think the fundamental notion of positive sum versus zero sum is something that we have to be able to hold on to and be able to advocate for to a skeptical American public.
Hey, jump in on something I agree with what Jake said. Maybe it is born out of the president's experience doing New York real estate. There may be some New York real estate people here in the room who can tell me whether this really is the dog-eat-dog environment, but he very much does have this view of zero-sum, that we cannot sort of work together where we all win and raise all the boats. But one other difference that I know you all agree with, but we haven't really touched on it yet, we've been sort of talking about the rules-based order and the zero-sum view and the bargain with other countries, mostly in sort of economic and trade and maybe security terms and who pays for things. But the other thing really that is different about this president is that he really doesn't talk about and doesn't seem to care about the idea of America and American values. And I actually do think that is I would like to think that his supporters really do believe in that. The polling suggests that they're proud of the United States, and that the part of the being proud of the United States is not that we are proud that we can beat up on other countries and at the end of the day put our foot on their throats until we win. It is that the idea of America since the beginning of the Republic has been an ideal that other countries have looked to. We have been imperfect. So, I worked for Condoleezza Rice for 8 years. She was fond of saying that, when the founders of our country treated her forebears as 2/5 of a man. She had on her wall in the Secretary of State's office a picture of Thomas Jefferson for two reasons. One, he was the first Secretary of State, and it was a reminder of how far we had come. He was a great American, but he was a flawed American. So the United States has flaws, but other countries do look to us for our values, for the respect for the individual, for the things that are in our Constitution, the free press, the free judiciary, rule of law, freedom of religion. And we sadly have got a president who doesn't seem to believe in any of those things, or at least he doesn't believe that it's his job as President of the United States to promote those things. And so that really is a difference, and it's something that I suspect his supporters would, if focusing on it, would say, well, no, we don't want the United States simply to be feared around the world. We want the United States to be respected and to exercise the values leadership that it always has. Last point on this, and I expect we'll get more into it. If you look at the national security strategy of the United States that was issued in December of last year, which actually had a lot of good things in it, the words human rights appear only once, and that's with respect to denying human rights abusers entry into the United States, but nothing about promotion of human rights around the world. Only talk about American values as if American values are not values that the rest of the world should care about or that we should try to promote.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
So I fully agree with what Jake and John have said, and I just want to take it one extra step, or at least something that I've thought about in my own mind on this. Almost every national security strategy prior to Trump administration, the sort of typical things that are indicated as goals to achieve are security, opportunity or prosperity, and values, right? That these are the things that we're pushing forward on. And one of the things that I think was sort of one of the premises of, even in the 1980s, the frameworks and the international engagement that we were involved in, was this idea that through this sort of all, boats will rise on this tide, in a sense, was that by engaging in the economic international system, that over time, that would lead to a shift in values for other countries, right? And I think that is one thing that we overestimated, that basically by engaging in the economic international system, that would inevitably lead to a shift in values that was more aligned with democratic values and the United States values. And I think we also underestimated the vulnerability that various trend lines, including technologies, have created for open societies. In other words, I see an inordinate number of places where you see a kind of an asymmetric issue where basically what makes the United States strong in many respects is also what are our key vulnerabilities. And the fact that we are an open society, that we hopefully encourage dissenting views, that we have a variety of different voices in our society, is also something that can be used against us in ways that have been problematic, whether it be through cyber and other information pieces. And I think thinking about how we craft an international framework moving forward that actually addresses that piece and says, okay, the economics is not enough, right? That we actually need to think through the rest of these pieces and how it is that we're pushing countries in a direction that we think is aligned with how we're thinking about the world and what's best from our perspective and from their perspective, hopefully, in the context of individual rights and pieces that we believe should be valued for all. So.
Great, thank you. So the National Security Strategy issued in 2017, having been mentioned, that's a good opportunity to pivot to that. And in many ways, I should say that the new understandings about the sort of top-line priorities when it comes to national security strategy reflected in that document are informing the work of the Center and how we're charting where we want to be focusing our energy and time going forward. One of the interesting claims in the 2017 National Security Strategy is that, and I'm quoting, China and Russia want to shape a world antithetical to US values and interests. So, two-part question. Is that true? And if it is, doesn't that rather powerfully affect what we could possibly hope for in terms of a multilateral rules-based order going forward, especially if the United States can't be counted upon to be a kind of consistent leader in that effort? And might it not even suggest that a multilateral international rules-based order is not worth emphasizing in the same way, because these two rather significant players internationally can't be counted on to pursue anything other than a set of ends that are antithetical to US values? Or is the premise wrong? Is the claim in the strategy document just wrong?
Well, I would start by saying that whether the premise is right or wrong, it is now so broadly shared across the US political spectrum that this isn't just a new feature of how, in the laws of physics, this is where things are going to go on US foreign policy, I predict.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Bernie Sanders gave a speech just in the last couple of weeks, I think at SAIS, in which he talked about an axis of authoritarianism led by China and Russia, very much along the lines of Donald Trump's national security strategy. So if you have Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both basically making the same case about where this is all going with China and Russia, and by the way, the US-China community has spent the last 2 years essentially concluding we got it all wrong about China. You know, we had this bet that economic integration and liberalization would lead to political liberalization, would lead to them integrating nicely into this rules-based order. That didn't happen, so now, you know, we got to rethink everything aggressively around this notion of competition. I think there's some truth in this, just to speak to the premise itself. I think there's some truth to it, but that the claims are overdrawn. And I think they do too much conflation of China and Russia, who represent very different challenges in the international system. I think Russia would like nothing more than to destabilize, disrupt, and undermine the rules-based international order and any aspect of it that is US-led. And a lot of that has to do with the calculus that Vladimir Putin has made about creating more space for his own brand of authoritarianism and pushing the pressure that was on his system further and further away from his borders. But honestly, part of it for him is that Russia's place in a rules-based international order on the major questions of the day would necessarily be kind of second class compared to the United States and China, because their economy is somewhere between South Korea and Australia's in terms of GDP. They're not going to be a major player on things like climate. So there are some issues on which they can be significant, but he's seen a lot of issues where they can't. So better to be a first-class disruptor than a second-class player in the system. China, of course, is going to at some point be the largest economy in the world, has a voice on every one of these significant issues. And I do believe that they would like to not be permanently on defense on these values questions. They don't want to feel under pressure. So to the extent they can, to use a phrase that one of our colleagues, Tom Wright, has used, if they can make the world safe for authoritarianism, not make the world authoritarian, not engage in a Cold War-style struggle where they're trying to defeat the West, but just make the world safe so their system doesn't feel the kind of pressure internally from the US and Europe and these international human rights organs, that would be good. So I do think that they will be playing offense on these issues. And Avril made the point about technology and how, you know, at the height of the Arab revolutions, we saw technology as the great democratizer. And now today we talk about technology as being the ultimate tool of the authoritarians because of what China is doing with facial recognition technology, social credit, and so forth. I think they are going to try to export that, lift that up for other countries. And Xi Jinping said something very interesting in the 19th Party Congress. He said now the Chinese model is an option, a new option for other countries to consider. Something no Chinese leader had said before. But I don't believe this is, you know, Cold War style stuff from China. I think they just want to essentially break the back of the politically liberal part of the rules-based order while participating actively in an economic order, in a problem-solving order on major questions around climate, counterterrorism, nuclear proliferation, and so forth. And if they can somehow sever off the liberal part they would be quite happy. And so that is the struggle. And for the US, for our foreign policy, managing the competitive aspect of this, including around this issue of ideology or quasi-ideology, while also thinking about the cooperative aspect where we need to work with the Chinese on huge global questions of economic stability, of transnational threats and the like, that will be quite a challenge. But I think that statement goes too far in conflating these two countries and in drawing too simplistic a view of what they're trying to accomplish. But underlying it, there is some truth to it.
Anyone else on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I just, I think the very fact that Putin is pushing back against the international order, and the very fact that China is trying to figure out how to manage it and not always be on the defense, is also just a sign of the strength of it, in a sense, right? I mean, they both have to deal with it. And the fact is that most of it was authored by the United States, right? And most of it is in our national interests. And I think the real challenge is in developing it also from our perspective in a way that actually takes advantage of that position, but at the same time evolves it to be consistent with what our interests are going forward, and to again sort of bring it back so that the expectations can be realistic about what it is that it's supposed to achieve. And that's the place that I think right now I'm most concerned we are not going to achieve that, because because of our own dysfunction, we're not going to be capable of getting into a leadership position and actually evolving the system in a way that I think makes sense among ourselves and our partners and allies, those that should be our partners and allies, I hope.
Well, just very quickly, at the 100,000-foot level, if you were doing a national security strategy and you are saying, what are the top national security issues for the country to deal with across all of the government, and you got to have a strategy to deal with it. You know, there are lots of smaller problems like terrorism and Al-Qaeda and ISIS to the extent that it's still there, and cybersecurity, and these are all important issues. But at the most macro level where you have to have a strategy, do something about it, it's Russia and China. And this really is a change. I mean, Russia and China have always been countries we've got to deal with up and down, but recently we do have China really asserting its influence all around the world, not necessarily in a malevolent way, the way Russia is, but they do not share the same democratic values that we do, and they are spreading influence into areas where the U.S. is withdrawn. U.S. had strong influence in Africa, and China has just really moved in all across Africa, but all across the world, so that we have to do something to address that. And then I agree with what Jake has said about Russia. I mean, we've had real significant changes in the last 6 or 7 years with Russia essentially just taking Crimea and the world looking the other way, disruption in Syria, killing its nationals in Britain. We've forgotten the fact that they shot down a passenger aircraft and the world just simply looked the other way. Russia, as Jake said, really is playing a disruptive influence. And so in terms of having a national security strategy, we have to figure out the best way to do that. That doesn't mean just being confrontational. We have to work together with Russia, but we can't just sort of ignore things when they engage in bad behavior. So you do have to have a strategy to deal with both of these countries.
Trevor, if I could just put one other thing on the table in talking about the rules-based order in these countries. It's a lot of the things that have happened over the last 15 years, you could say are either good evidence that the international order is under real stress, or you could say it's proof that it's really resilient. The reason I raise that right now is because China looks at, particularly on the international economic order side, a set of institutions that are US built, US led, and says, we want to be a bigger part of this. So they created something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, which the United States chose not to join, but basically everybody, more or less everybody else did. Their original concept for that was probably more of a corrupt, non-transparent, non-accountable alternative to the Asian Development Bank, which was the US-led institution. But as it went along, this became an institution kind of in the image of the rules-based order, you know, in terms of its governance, the way it does its loans. So is that the unraveling of the rules-based international order, or is that actually the effective evolution of it to take account of a major actor on the stage who's actually adjusting its own approach so that the AIIB is more of a story of success of the order rather than the failure of the order? People can answer that differently, but that's a big question for me. Similarly, and this goes back to what both John and Avril were talking about with treaties, I think the fact that the United States cannot ratify treaties today is only part of the answer for why we're seeing these sort of more politically binding than legally binding arrangements in the world. I think another big part of the answer is that's what all the other major players want too. They want to participate and they want to calibrate ambition against having less compliance costs or less kind of feeling as though they're going to be held legally accountable in some way. This was certainly the case in the climate context, certainly the case with the Iranians in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. I'm not sure they would have gone for a legally binding treaty. And so another question we have to ask ourselves is the fact that we're moving to less formal legal arrangements for these problem-solving purposes necessarily a weakening of the order? Or could it be, again, an evolution that allows for greater participation and greater ambition, maybe at the expense of the compliance side of it, but that net-net, that works out in favor of better problem solving? Again, people can come on both sides of that, but those are two hard questions for me as I look at the evolution of this order.
So that's a great question. It's so great, in fact, it was next on my list to ask, although you've articulated it much better. I mean, a kind of narrow version of what you've just posed is to ask whether the role of international law-oriented lawyers within the United States is different in this new regime or new period, if indeed there is one. If we're talking about international arrangements that, to the extent they're concluded, are, if binding at all, only through political mechanisms, enforced only through political mechanisms and not legally binding, if there just are fewer treaties being concluded, then this sounds like a regime of, to the extent we're talking about law at all, we're talking about more informal or customary kinds of norms or claims made with respect to them. And maybe on most big ticket items, we're not really even going to claim to be talking about law at all. Does this portend, Trump administration or no Trump administration, does this portend a future where the legal advisor in the State Department is a less consequential officer, for example?
You should answer.
That would be an unfortunate thing. Just to make sure we have everybody on the same page on what we're talking about on sort of treaties versus non-treaties. The treaty, of course, is negotiated by the executive branch and then is submitted for advice and consent to the Senate. You got to have 2/3, and the president ultimately ratifies it. It can be either multilateral, lots of countries, or bilateral, just 2 countries. And we've had historically big multilateral treaties and then bilateral treaties. In what Jake's referring to, with which I agree and disagree, is for complex issues, certainly the Obama administration in the climate change agreement and then the Iran deal turned to agreements with other countries that were not done in the form of treaties, and in fact were not even legally binding. This is actually key. So the Iran deal, the talking points rise, it's not even an agreement. It was referred to as an arrangement because it wasn't.
It was a plan.
A plan.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
These are things that only White House lawyers can love. On the theory that it actually wasn't even binding as a matter of international law. It certainly wasn't a treaty, but they were really just political commitments to each other. We would do things if you would do things. So you couldn't really break it Now, that hasn't prevented Iran from suing us currently in the International Court of Justice for pulling out of it, something we can talk about. But there has been a trend, because our Senate, and this gets to many of the points we're talking about, has gotten to be so conservative, so suspicious of treaties as somehow a symbol of weakness, and we've lost the number of sort of moderate Republicans of which there used to be 15 or 20 that you could reliably count on to support treaties. And I just won't vote for them anymore. Rand Paul, for example, will not even vote for a bilateral tax treaty where people can benefit through favorable tax treatment because he's worried that, other countries will ask for information about Americans from our IRS. So, where there had been long support for treaties as the way you get things from other countries. This is how we get things from other countries. You reach agreements with them, and before you, and it's binding so that you can get what you want. And if it reaches a certain level of bindingness, the Senate has to approve it. And we've lost that consensus in the Senate with senators thinking that all treaties really are bad and suspicious things. And I don't know whether we will come back or not. So I do think there's a change there, Jake. We have historically done lots of other agreements with other countries through government-to-government agreements that don't have to go through the Senate, or arrangements or plans. And maybe because of this trough that we're in where we've lost this consensus about how we get things from other countries, we will just have to stop doing treaties. One of our colleagues, who many of you know, Ona Hathaway at Yale, wrote a paper a couple of years ago called The Death of Treaties. And at the time I thought, well, that's overstating it, and she's being provocative. But it's true that we're actually having a very difficult time getting treaties through the Senate. So any administration, if it wants an agreement with another country, has got to figure out different ways to do it.
I think there are some practical implications to not being able to get advice and consent treaties done. And just to name a few to build on what's been said, obviously, by John and Jake, is we have international agreements that we treated as treaties, many of which set up, for example, fundamental international organizations in our system today, right? And when you amend them, the expectation is that they go back to the Senate for advice and consent. It's very hard at this point to shift gears and say, oh no, that's a congressional executive. And, or it requires something else or doesn't require any kind of attention within the system. So it has some practical things. But I agree that it's not everything. And I think probably we all do, but I do see it as a kind of a proxy for the way in which the country is reacting to international law and these issues. And I think that's the piece that I think is sort of most challenging and difficult, and one that doesn't just apply to treaties, but applies more generally to these issues. I mean, the very fact that somebody comes up and says, I don't like any of those words, international liberal order, tells you something.
It
right?
wouldn't have gotten better if you'd included law in that.
Right, it would not have gotten better. That's exactly right. So I do think that's one of the challenges that we're facing. On the other hand, one of the things that I do find really interesting about what we've seen in terms of, figuring out different mechanisms, which obviously is tried and true and the kind of innovation that lawyers love. But for law school, I mean, I think we're sort of ripe for a whole new set of tools and thinking for how it is that you do these kind of international transactions. And I think the climate change agreement is a good example. Like, for example, if you think that, look, there are increasingly other actors besides states that are critical to actually developing and promoting an international engagement strategy and framework, right? Then what you want maybe is agreements that leave space for those non-state actors to get to a place, right, but figure out their own way of doing that, right, which is a kind of a way in which Paris Agreement works in a sense. Like, so, and that isn't just about states versus the private sector, but it's also about sub-entities of states, right, and other kind of actors in the system that are capable of innovating. And I think that's a really interesting piece. I think another piece is just thinking about, I've said, when you would go to a multilateral negotiation, the United States was by no means perfect at this, but generally better than other states at bringing along stakeholders within our society that actually had an interest in the international agreement. If you looked at private international law multilateral agreements, you'd see the private sector would frequently be represented through professional organizations or otherwise on the delegation. You would have a variety of discussions, right? Things like, we need to find more ways for all of us, all countries essentially, to be able to inject stakeholders into the process in a way that allows the agreements to be more effective across the board and take into account their interests. And, in the trade area, that's an obvious example of where it's not just about corporate America, but it should also be about labor, and how do you think about these pieces, and how do you develop mechanisms using new technologies, new sort of innovative legal structures to actually promote that in a way that allows these agreements to be more reflective of basically the people that are going to be have it applied to. So
Can I interject? I could take a moment of Jake's time. I'll be real quicker. I know we've been talking about airy concepts, and I want to give a specific example, and then you can think about how you all would have come out. So the last major multilateral treaty that the Senate considered and that failed, and I was slightly critical of the Obama administration about the way it was handled, but maybe it wouldn't have come out, was the UN Disabilities Convention. This is about 6 years ago. This was a multilateral human rights treaty that would essentially have internationalized the Americans with Disabilities Act. Americans with Disabilities Act was actually done under George H.W. Bush, and requires ramps and wheelchair access, and can be difficult for small businesses and so forth. But it's a good thing. It allows access for the disabled. You've got the ramps right out here at NYU. We were in compliance with this, so all it was doing was internationalizing something we were already doing to get other countries around the world to also provide disability access. And so it was a treaty to do that. Conservatives, going back, reflecting this history of suspicion of multilateralism and so forth, voted this down because they were worried that the monitoring body for the Disabilities Convention, a group of experts that look to see whether countries are complying, would then criticize the United States for maybe not complying. They couldn't have done it in a binding way, but they might have criticized the United States. People in the Senate went so far as to say, well, they might criticize us for homeschooling because that might be not providing disability rights. So this was voted down on the floor of the Senate. Bob Dole had actually been wheeled out onto the floor of the Senate in support, and his Republican colleagues voted it down with him sitting there in his wheelchair on the floor of the Senate. And it was a sad moment. My criticism of the Obama administration for the way it was handled was that Secretary Kerry tried to present it essentially as American human rights leadership that the world ought to follow, with which I agree. But that is not the way to convince sadly, conservative Republican senators that it's in our interest. I would have said, and tried, this gets to your stakeholder point, Avril, is to try to say, look, for all of you senators around the United States, if you want your disabled soldiers to be able to, go up to the Louvre and go up a wheelchair ramp or have an elevator or something, the Louvre probably already has wheelchair ramps, but we want other countries to basically come up to US standards so that it will help Americans, that this would have been a better way to sell it. But anyway, this shows you a specific treaty that was voted down by the Senate, even though it reflected values that we were already doing at home, because conservative Republican senators were worried that this would interfere with the sovereignty of the United States. So it was a sad moment, but it sort of shows you where we are, and I'd be interested in sort of, would you have been in favor or against that treaty? I've probably not given you enough information.
Well, Trevor, you asked originally, is there still a role for lawyers? I will say, having worked on the Iran nuclear deal quite intimately, we had a lawyer whose job it was to make sure the deal was not legally binding, who literally would take the document and scrub it of any law.
Take out shall.
So there's a full employment opportunity for lawyers just to remove law from international agreements going forward. I kid you not.
It's a new curriculum for us,
Who'd point out where that word agreed snuck into like the 5th footnote of the 17th annex, and we'd get it out of there. But I'll just give the case of Sue Biniaz, who some people in this room will know, who was a but-for cause of the Paris Climate Agreement. But for Sue Biniaz, you probably don't have a Paris Climate Agreement. She was in L. As John said, the agreement, the Paris Climate Accord is not legally binding except for in certain process elements. And yet, there is absolutely a central role for international lawyers on questions of how you make these trade-offs, how you construct these arrangements, how you think about the nature of consideration between countries, how and the institutional knowledge and memory of the collaborative efforts to deal with these big transnational challenges is so deep in the United States in our legal advisor's office that I actually think there will only be more need for lawyers to be grappling in this netherworld between legally binding and politically binding, not less. And I'll just give one more example. The WHO is the UN body to handle global health issues. But today, if you think about the major progress the world has made on global health, it's been through PEPFAR, the Global Fund, Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, each of which is some combination of informal rules, multiple stakeholders, private sector, public sector, civil society, and each of them have required intense legal or quasi-legal arrangements behind them to make sure they can operate effectively, and they implicate huge domestic legal questions around generics and the like. But to me, just because the formal institution of the old rules-based order, the WHO, is not effectively executing against these issues doesn't mean the order is failing. It means we've come up with alternative mechanisms that in a way are succeeding better to make huge progress on a huge issue. And so I'm actually quite sympathetic to finding resilience and sustainability in this order through flexibility and informality. And I don't think that reduces the power of rules and norms over time. It just means that the getting from here to there to a more sticky, law-based system, more fully with greater compliance and greater participation, yes, that will take a long time, but I think it's only going to have to bring in more of the best and brightest legal minds because of the complexities that all of us on the panel have been talking about.
Great, yep. I agree. I just wanted to hear you say it. We've got time for some questions from the audience, and we have 2 mics here, so let me invite you to one of the mics, and try and keep your question as a question so that we can get through as many of them as possible. Please.
Yes, I'm Albert Goldson, Cerulean Counsel. We focus on geopolitical risk. You've talked quite extensively about the U.S. and China and Russia, and one missing piece that's going through tremendous changes right now is Germany. Merkel's coalition is, in fact, imploding as we speak, and they've always been the bulwark against previously the Soviet Union and now Russia. The question specifically for Mr. Bellinger, of course, the other panelists can, give their input. From the macro perspective, where does this lead the relationship between the United States and Russia as Germany is going through these changes and possibly having a party that's quite anti-U.S.?
Well, I don't think I have any particularly unique insights on that, so I'll be short and invite my colleagues. It's a problem. We've really been able to rely for the last 20 years on a very stable Germany. Chancellor Merkel has really done a good job, as has her predecessors, in playing a constructive role in Europe. And was one of the saddest things was frankly see President Trump essentially sort of kick her in the shins when he was over suggesting that he wishes that she would leave. Particularly at a time when Britain is going through the Brexit and we're losing the British role in Europe in May at this point, who will then be the leader of Europe? So it's a problem, and I don't have a good answer for you.
Okay, here.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for a really meaty presentation this morning. I'm Bob Dreyfus. I write for Rolling Stone and The Nation magazine and some others. John mentioned that the rules-based international order isn't perfect, hasn't been perfect for a while, it leads me to wonder whether some of the, if you look back over the last 15 years at the invasion of Iraq, which was considered by Kofi Annan and many other international lawyers to be illegal, the attack on Libya, America's role in torturing prisoners, the drone wars of the last 15 years. All of these things could be considered to be unilateral, or I think somebody mentioned predatory unilateralism, even though there was a coalition of the willing somehow involved in this. Doesn't that, in a way, kind of then, isn't that being echoed in China's actions in the South China Sea or Russia's occupation of Crimea? And they both justify, like, well, we can do this because look at what the United States did. And I guess even the Saudis might argue that vis-a-vis Khashoggi, like, well, we don't have drones, but we'll just chop the guy up, where we find him. I mean, hasn't the U.S. in a way set the stage for some of this pushback now about challenging this rules-based order?
In a word, yes, to an extent. I mean, certainly when I was legal advisor, as I would try to sort of preach support for an international legal system, we were accused of hypocrisy, both in the Bush administration, but also more generally. It just wasn't the Iraq War or Guantanamo or other things. So certainly, other countries feel the United States does not always live up to its word, and it goes back to my point about Secretary Rice in the beginning of the country. That said, I do think that historically we have been significantly different from other countries. We can be criticized for not following the rules ourselves, big or small, but we have still been the country that has led on human rights, and it would be that when we would go and lecture other countries about human rights, they would often say, well, what about X or what about Y? But we were still successful in exercising that leadership. So I think that you're right to a point, but that the United States still has been the country that other countries have looked to for leadership on both sort of a rules-based system generally, international institutions, and on human rights, even if we have not perfectly followed the rules ourselves.
Do you want to say something? One thing I struggle with is this question of precedent. When the U.S. does something negative, unlawful, is that what leads Russia then says, oh, I guess I can do that too? Or is it Putin was going to do it anyway, and now he's just looking for a kind of a creative, clever, debating points answer? And if you listen to his speeches, I mean, he's very good at this, at sort of saying, okay, Crimea and Kosovo, and he can pull it all together. But I get the distinct sense that his major calculus here is not thinking fair is fair, I'm just relating to the international rules-based order the way the Americans are, that he's going to do his thing anyway. That doesn't answer your question as to whether it was wrong to invade Iraq, which I think it was, or I think Libya's in a different context because you did have a UN Security Council resolution, but some of the other things you described, torture and the like. But where I kind of get off the bus, and the US should be seeking to live up to its highest ideals at all times, where I kind of get off the bus is giving Putin or the Chinese or anyone else a pass because they say, well, we just did it because you made us, because you did it. I find that a pretty insincere mode of argument. It doesn't mean that we haven't then exposed ourselves to that argument and have to deal with that. But I'm having watched this a lot, especially from Putin over the last few years. I have to say I'm sort of dubious.
We have time for a couple more, I think. Here.
Yeah. Well, I think the U.S. has always led in the ought, that we ought to treat all men, all human beings as equal. We've given up the ought. And domestically, in the way we see voter suppression and things like that, the rest of the world says the U.S. is no longer an ought. But I want to reframe some of this. I think I'm sorry, Jonathan Granoff. I'm the president of the Global Security Institute, and I'm the chair of the Task Force on nuclear nonproliferation of the International Law section of the American Bar Association. Okay, so there are a number of existential threats that are pressing the gift of time that the world faces that transcend the capacity of nations alone to address. Climate is the one that's most well known, but I would say phytoplankton and the health of the oceans is of equal importance because it's our third lung. It produces 50 to 70% of our oxygen. I had a discussion with one of the Koch brothers in which I asked him what his secret sauce was to protect our third lung, and he didn't know about it. We've inadequately put forward the case that there are existential threats that require every human being on the planet to address, and that these international institutions are the only way to do that. The market simply cannot protect phytoplankton. The other existential threat is one that's created by states uniquely, which is nuclear weapons. And now we have a nuclear posture review that has lowered the threshold of the use of nuclear weapons, basically ignored any obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty to negotiate elimination, which is a legal duty under Article 6 of the treaty. Calling for the weaponization of space looks like a pursuit of hegemony, and the justification that's given by the administration and all previous administrations is we need to have strategic stability. So on the one hand, we're pursuing military advantage through modernization, and the other hand, we're saying we want strategic stability. This incoherence does not bode well for the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and the regime. Now, this is an issue that is, again, pressing against time because it's existential. How do we make the case better to the American people that these institutions are essential for our survival?
Just very quickly on this, because it's come up a few times, I may be in just a different, slightly more optimistic place than the American people, and that's kind of funny coming from me after 2016. I think we have what John described as an ebb and flow on, and Avril talked about, Jesse Helms and others, that we've always had a struggle in our Congress about our relation to international cooperation. There's no doubt about it. And that reflects something in the American public, but I do not believe that American public opinion is a major constraint to global cooperation on big issues like the oceans or climate change or nuclear proliferation. I don't. Public opinion may be a constraint on particular deals like the Iran deal, but even the Paris Climate Agreement itself has broad-based support across Democrats and Republicans. Now, Americans are ambivalent about their relationship to the world. So if a president comes along and says, you've just gotten screwed all the time, and they'll listen to that. But if a president comes along and says, you know what, we got to rally the nations of the world to deal with this problem of the oceans, I don't actually believe that right now we're looking at a public at large that is a major check on a president's capacity to do something about that. So leadership to me matters more than and obviously then you have to relate it back to people, but I give more credit to the American people on these questions of international cooperation around issues. That's not going to change the treaty problem in the Senate because of the unique composition of the Senate, but I don't think it should stop an aggressive effort on each of these things. And for me, the real issue is less about the case than it is about figuring out how you get the mechanism of cooperation designed effectively so that it can be sustainable.
Yeah, I'll add just a little bit to that. I mean, I think we're going to have more and more opportunities to actually to help people understand the value of international engagement. And you know, you gave obviously very good examples. Another one from my perspective is health. I mean, the fact that an infectious disease can become a pandemic, you know, quite rapidly, and unless we're figuring out how to work with other countries, use resources from the World Health Organization, others, as we did in the context of Ebola, but obviously this issue will continue, we're not going to be able to address what is a very real fear for many people throughout the United States when those types of events occur. And I do think that helping people to see the value in those moments basically to the international organizations and the agreements that we craft is a way of helping them to see that. And I also think that one of the challenges that we've had that we should be thoughtful about, you know, obviously for the future, is this question of what's the process by which we come to those agreements, and what's the process by which we make decisions in international organizations and entities? Because I do think that one of the challenges is that many people, I think in the country, see that as sort of a black box in a way, that there's a little bit greater understanding of how things work in Washington, and there's a lot, obviously, that people don't like about that, but it seems like a process that is understood and legitimized by the foundational documents of our country, right? Whereas what happens on the international plane is perceived sometimes as quite illegitimate, right? Like, why does, you know, Bangladesh have the same amount of voice as the United States in this arena? How did this agreement get agreed to? Why is it this person who's sitting at the table for the United States in that scenario? And I think trying to help people understand that there is a legitimate process, or, you know, explaining it and putting it forward will also help in some respects in this area. But I don't know that frankly, I discount my views on this, and I think I'm the least qualified of the three of us to answer this question.
Take a couple more questions.
Okay, we've got time for one more. Yeah.
Oh, I hate to, I'm Richard Field, the ABA's deputy representative to the UN and member of ACPIL. And Jonathan did get at some of my question, which is, as the world order is evolving, how big a role is there for the UN's 2030 agenda generally, and maybe specifically here, what's the role for students here at the law school or US practitioners?
Oh, no.
That one's
no,
yours.
You got, no. You go ahead.
I guess let me take the second part first, because, you know, that's why we're all here, it's I think a disheartening time for a lot of students of international law right now. I spend a lot of time talking to students about whether now is the time to go into the legal advisor's office or to go into government. But you know, my answer is do it. I mean, your country needs you. A lot of this is going on at sort of upper levels that are not going to affect you directly. And I think to go back to something that we said at the very beginning, you know, we're at a troubling period domestically and internationally, but some of this stuff has been there for a long time, and we need to get through it. And I think students should have an important role to play here, and I would encourage them to continue to apply for the jobs that they have always applied for in government, at the Justice Department, at the State Department, the Defense Department. You know, people can make a real difference. So it's a simple message, but I would hate to see us lose a generation of law students who are concerned that they can't make a difference in government.
Hear, hear. Well, I hope
Sir,
you'll all join
sir,
me in thanking the
could us
panelists here.
girls
I'm
have a
sorry.
chance?
We're going to finish here. Thank you.